This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre and associate diagnostician Chandler Day as they discuss wheat streak mosaic virus and how to manage it. AJ Tarpoff, K-State Extension beef veterinarian, continues the show with the rerun of his interview with reminders on how cattle producers can help mitigate heat stress. The best time to divide irises is late July through early August when the plant is dormant. K-State Research and Extension horticulture agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, ends today's show saying dividing irises every 3 to 5 years helps rejuvenate the plant and increase flowering. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about wheat streak mosaic virus with K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre and associate diagnostician Chandler Day. Kelsey, Chandler, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Of course.
Kelsey, what is wheat streak mosaic virus?
Yeah, so this is a disease that's probably no stranger to a lot of our wheat producers in Kansas. It's a disease that's actually caused by a complex of viruses. Unfortunately, we don't just have one virus at play. We have the wheat streak mosaic virus itself, but we also have a virus called triticum mosaic virus and another one called wheat mosaic virus that's sometimes referred to as high plains. And there are a few other viruses in the mix that can really damage wheat, cause that mosaic symptom, that yellowing symptom in the field, and can lead to severe yield loss, especially when those infections happen in the fall or early spring. Now, those viruses are vectored by that tiny wheat curl mite, which is very difficult to manage. We can't manage that with insecticides. And the problem is that tiny curl mite houses all of those viruses. So when we harvest after the wheat dries down for the season, those curl mites are looking for somewhere to hide. They'll hop into either volunteer wheat or some other grass species, and they'll hang out there if we keep that green bridge going until we plant in the fall, right? And that can be when we see some of our most severe infections. So really, this is the time when we're putting out the messaging that we really need to be vigilant and careful about controlling our volunteer wheat, right? So we want to break that bridge, kill that volunteer where those curl mites are surviving. The best way to do that is usually through herbicide applications or through tillage, but we really just want to make sure any wheat that survived after harvest is killed off within 2 weeks of planting our fall crop. Even better, we can kill off that volunteer early in the summer and stave off some of those cycles of mites that can reproduce through our summer months.
And important to kill off that volunteer wheat, but do producers need to be careful that it doesn't just go to some other grass and the curl mite hang out there?
Yeah, so it is the wheat curl mite. So we see in most cases it does prefer wheat, volunteer wheat. And usually when we see big outbreaks, we have some volunteer wheat nearby, but it can survive on other grasses. Pretty much anything that's a grass is a good host for the wheat curl mite. There's some preferences, right? So cheatgrass is one, or smooth brome there is one that can be an important host. Barnyard grass, some of the grasses that we find in our ditches. And then some of our cover crop species like triticale can host our curl mites. Other cereals can host curl mites. Even corn can host curl mites. So they can be out in the landscape, but again, we typically find that they have a high preference for volunteer wheat. So we typically see if we can manage the volunteer, we can keep those curl mites under control. Places that we find volunteer that sometimes can surprise us, summer crops. So say we have some milo or soybean and we had volunteer there. Maybe we had a failed summer crop. That'd be some place to just watch out for. And also if we're cover cropping, sometimes, we'll either have species in the cover crop mixture that are good for curl mites to survive, or we'll just have volunteer wheat and cover crops. So that can be hard to manage. So again, these are scenarios that are tricky, but they're things that we have seen in Kansas over this past past several years.
Do you really see the wheat curl mite or just see the effects of it?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're so super small that it's very hard to see them with the naked eye, right? If you get down with a hand lens and you're really looking closely, you might be able to see them, but they're mostly invisible to just our naked eye. But they can move pretty long distances, right? So they can catch a wind and move into neighboring fields and can cause some pretty bad damage. They're so small and they can hide in the architecture of the plant. So it's actually almost impossible to kill them off with insecticides and those types of things.
Besides breaking that green bridge, are there other tools that producer could be able to use to help reduce the chances of having wheat streak mosaic virus?
Yeah, so again, controlling your volunteer and that habitat for those mites is very important. We do have varieties that have some level of resistance, but the warning there is that none of them are a silver bullet, right? So you can check. Soon we'll be releasing our Kansas Wheat Variety Guide where we have updated ratings for varieties for the wheat streak mosaic complex. But an important thing to note is that none of our varieties are perfect. So we do have some resistance genes. We have a gene called WSM2 that provides some protection against the virus. We have a gene for the curl mite that can slow down feeding, but we don't want to set any unrealistic expectations. If we do have a wheat streak situation in a neighboring field or in a field nearby, we will still see symptoms in those varieties. But it is important to double check, especially if you're planting into a high-risk situation. We can find some varieties that'll tolerate that infection a little bit better.
What has it looked like for this year?
Yeah, so this was a year that we saw wheat streak across the state, which is a bit unusual. So again, this is something that's a perennial issue in western Kansas. We're seeing it more frequently in central Kansas, and this year we even had cases in northeast and southeast Kansas, and it was pretty ubiquitous, although levels varied across the northern tier of counties in the state. What that means is we just need to be very careful about controlling our volunteer going into this next season. We do have Chandler here who runs the Diagnostic lab. So if you haven't interacted with Chandler, she's a great resource for diagnosing these wheat viruses. So maybe we'll bounce it over to Chandler to see what you've seen coming through the Diagnostic lab this year.
Yeah, so we had quite a few wheat streak mosaic virus detections this year, like Kelsey said, across the entire state. We recently started testing for triticum mosaic virus, and we did find some single infections using our testing strategy in western Kansas. So sometimes we forget that wheat streak mosaic virus is a complex, and some of those resistance genes do not cover triticum mosaic. So it's always a good idea to do testing, make sure that you know what you're dealing with so that you know how to manage the wheat virus issue in the future.
Chandler, any recommendations for people who are hoping to submit a sample?
We always recommend that people collect and ship samples the same day using overnight shipping. That's especially important in wheat because it can degrade quickly in the mail. So we run wheat virus testing on Thursdays and Fridays during the wheat season. So sending samples earlier in the week. I work really hard to get results back out. If the sample comes in on a Wednesday, sample results go out on a Friday. So we try really hard to get those results back very quickly. It's a protein-based diagnostic test, and it takes 2 days to run. So it is important that they come earlier in the week.
Are people able to go through an extension office, or do they just need to interact with you directly, Chandler?
Yeah, so we always recommend that you reach out to your extension office first. They're the ones that know what's on the ground in their counties. And so they are very familiar with the diagnostic lab, and they can help you with the process of submitting a sample. Fees are reduced if you go through your extension office, but you can always send things directly to us as an individual.
What else could maybe a producer get tested at the diagnostic lab?
Yeah, so any kind of wheat health issue. So we do everything from root and foot rots to wheat viruses to head scab, any kind of leaf diseases. Beyond just wheat, we also do testing on all row crops as well as horticulture and homeowner samples.
If people are wanting to find out more information about this, how do you recommend they do that?
Yeah, you can always give us a call or check out our webpage, which is through the plant pathology extension website.
Kelsey, if people are wanting to find out more information about wheat streak mosaic virus or anything around it, how do you recommend they take the time to do that?
Sure. So we have some good publications through the KSRE bookstore. So you can check out the publication on wheat streak mosaic virus. Another one, again, that I mentioned earlier, but I'll plug again, is the Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. That's a great place to go. We'll have the updated version out within the next week or so, where you can go and check your favorite varieties rating so you can help plan accordingly for next season. Of course, you can always go to your local extension office. They should be the first stop for some of this information. And then you can always reach out to us here in the plant pathology department directly.
Kelsey, Chandler, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about wheat streak mosaic virus and getting some diagnostic testing done.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre, and she was joined by associate diagnostician Chandler Day as they talked about wheat streak mosaic virus. If you'd like to learn more about wheat streak mosaic virus, you can find publications on it by going to the K-State Research and Extension bookstore at Bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu, or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you're looking to find more information about the K-State Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab, you can navigate to it by going to plantpath.ksu.edu, or you can give them a call at 785-532-6176. Once again, that is 785-532-6176. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Extension Beef Veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff as he reminds us once again about ways cattle producers can help mitigate heat stress for their livestock. We're now cutting to that short break.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. We continue our show by discussing heat stress with K-State Beef Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. A.J., thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
A.J., what is heat stress and what causes it within beef cattle?
Yeah, so heat stress is really the mechanisms that cattle try to adapt to a warmer temperature. You and I, whenever we get hot, we sweat. Right? And that's a way to be able to pull some of that heat away. The sweat evaporates and it pulls that heat off the body. So we're trying to maintain homeostasis. Well, for our livestock species, and especially cattle, they don't have the sweat producing capabilities. So what they do is they try to dissipate heat in other ways by, one, getting into more comfortable areas. Two, they actually increase their respiratory rate or their breathing. So they use their lungs, believe it or not, to be able to dissipate some of that heat. So what we'll see is animals start to pant. Okay, so if you can picture a dog panting, those are things that we might see as the body temperature starts to increase in cattle. That we'll start seeing some of those symptoms like heavier breathing or even open mouth breathing.
AJ, what specific temperatures and weather conditions make cattle the most prone to heat stress?
So when we think about heat stress or cold stress, any environmental stressor, there's four key parameters that we really think about with heat stress. And, obviously temperature and humidity. Everybody, when you wake up in the morning, check the news, you hear the forecast, and you'll get temperature. Okay. Well, temperature is only one piece of the pie. For how our animals really feel the environment around them, it's temperature, humidity, which we think about the humidity index, right? Sometimes we'll have some of those index scores that you'll hear on the radio or hear on the news. But with cattle, we take it a step further. The other two parameters that are missing in that heat index are wind speed and solar radiation. Okay, those four parameters really make up on the real feel for, if we really start thinking along the lines of how cattle feel the environment, because they're very different from us. Where we're comfortable, cattle, they might be uncomfortable, and vice versa. So when we really need to take into those four key parameters. And what's interesting is We actually have that in a model called an Animal Comfort Index, and that's available on the Kansas Mesonet website. So it uses those 4 parameters to give a real feel on how cattle are experiencing the environment in local areas around the state of Kansas.
Why should people be concerned about heat stress?
Why we care, why we manage, why we, really worry about this is it's the day in and day out. It is one of those critical chores, just as important as feeding or making sure the animals have water. Providing animal comfort is really an investment in our animals, whether we're asking them to be reproductive cows, out in the pasture, whether we're asking that animal to produce beef in a feedlot. Whatever we're asking that animal to do, when we invest in animal comfort, when scenarios get uncomfortable, when we invest in them, make them more comfortable, they are more productive, they're more profitable, and they really sustain, and we kind of build that suspension under those animals where they can handle more of some of the environmental constraints that are around them.
You mentioned before panting. Are there any other physical signs of heat stress that you can find in cattle?
Yeah, so some of the other physical signs, yes, we'll see increased breathing rates. One interesting piece is cattle, they don't lay down as much, especially whenever they get heat stress. They're trying to increase airflow. Unfortunately, that might lead to bunching, where groups of cattle, even in a pasture, will bunch up together. They're trying to get increased airflow, but they end up using each other as shade, which is kind of counterproductive. So we need to keep a close eye for that. Now, when given access, cattle may crowd around water tanks, right? Go down into ponds if they're out in a pasture. Unfortunately, that can lead to some problems where they don't have enough access to water, especially for a water tank. We'll always see the one animal standing in the water tank when the rest of them are trying to drink. So we have grouping, we have bunching, we have water-seeking and shade-seeking behaviors, and a lot increased standing. Okay, so those are all kind of different things that we can see when animals start to heat up or to experience some of those heat stress.
For cattle being housed in dry lots, what can be done to limit the effects of heat stress?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just want to make sure everybody understands heat stress is not a new phenomenon. We have been dealing with managing heat stress for as long as we've had domesticated cattle. Okay, so this isn't anything new, but how we house them, where we house them, may change some of our management strategies when things get hot, as those temperature and humidities rise, and maybe that wind starts to die down. We need to think about back to the basics. So whenever it comes to heat stress, it's back to the basics. Feed and water. Okay, water, when we're in a dry lot condition, just to put this into perspective, the water intake can nearly double as the temperature rises from 70 degrees to 90 degrees. So we can start thinking we need more access, we need more flow. Water availability for those animals is absolutely critical when the temperatures start to rise. A good reminder right now, especially if you have automatic water tanks, many times we have a winter level and a summer level. And the winter level, obviously, to keep it from freezing, is a little bit less flow, lower volume. We want to make sure those are bumped up to the summer levels to have maximum capacity. Increasing water tank capacity. Either we can split pens and increase water tank capacity that way, or even put some portable tubs into those pens to increase the water availability whenever those animals need it. So that's number one. Number two is feeding. Okay, some of our feeding, we might be able to modify our feeding times to be able to help alleviate some of these stressors. Whenever we feed cattle, we feed the rumen microbes in the rumen, and there's a cost to that. Yes, they can digest things that you and I cannot, but that comes at a cost of what we call the heat of fermentation. So as they digest those feedstuffs, they actually increase the amount of heat that they produce. So what we can try to do is we can change our feeding times or even adapt some of our feeding management. We can feed later in the evening, so that way the heat of digestion that happens 4 to 6 hours after they eat happens in the cooler nighttime hours. So feed and water, number one. Other than that, let's think about the pen floor itself. Okay, a pen floor can reach up to 140 degrees during the heat of the day. That's that solar radiation that really beats down and gets absorbed into that dirt floor. One thing that we can do is we can actually put out straw. We think about bedding for cold winter months. Bedding's also a phenomenal tool during heat stress events that we can plan ahead, get that bedding put into those pens, and we can reduce the pen floor temperature by up to 25 degrees just by putting out that bedding. That's one way. The other pieces are really more infrastructure based, and that would be shades and sprinklers. Sprinkler systems, we typically use sprinkler systems for more dust mitigation in our commercial feedlots. They can also be used to help cool the pen floors. We don't necessarily attribute those sprinklers to truly cooling the animals themselves, because that's difficult to accomplish in outdoor scenarios. We would actually have to soak the animal completely. But what our goal is to use those sprinklers in the nighttime cooling hours to be able to get a little moisture on that pen floor, to be able to allow that to evaporate so we can cool the pen floor in the overnight hours. And then shade. Obviously, shade's an investment. It's a piece of infrastructure. Recently finished a 2-year trial here at K-State at our beef stocker unit, showing some of the added benefits of investing into shade, and where we did see increased efficiency, increased growth rate and average daily gain, reduced panning rates, and also reduced water needs. That was kind of a neat attribute of that study, as we found that just shade by itself reduces water needs of those growing animals by over a gallon per head per day.
Can producers manage heat stress in cattle that are out on grass?
They can. So it's obviously animals out in the pasture, they have options. Okay, they can find the wind currents and some of the hills on the pastures. They can seek out some of the shaded areas. They can go stand in a pond if need be. So typically our animals out in the pasture, they don't have the same type of heat issues that we do in confinement. Remember, I mentioned the pen floor can get to that type of temperature. Out in a pasture, they have more access to different currents, different breezes, and the dirt and the grass does not reach that elevated temperature that it would on a dirt lot. So again, we just try to provide added support for those animals. Shade occasionally, if there's not shaded areas or draws with trees and things like that in it, they will seek out shade. I've even seen cattle line up behind a telephone pole just from the shade of a telephone pole. So sometimes providing some of that shade and some of that benefit, as long as we do give enough space for those animals so they don't bunch up. That would be the biggest thing with some of our pasture animals, but really water. Making sure they have clean access, ready access to water. They can sustain and they can adapt and they can do very well out in those pasture settings with pretty minimal maintenance from us.
Lastly, where should beef producers go to find more information about heat stress?
Yeah, more information. The KLA, Kansas Livestock Association, has a heat stress page on their website. You can go to ksubeef.org, which is our beef extension website, that we have some information available. Kansas Mesonet website, okay, mesonet.k-state.edu. So all of these tools that are available out there, there's information. You can find those tools, use them, plan accordingly, plan ahead, contact your veterinarian, contact folks that if you have questions on how to be more prepared in some of these scenarios, don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you for joining us, AJ.
Thank you.
That was K-State Beef Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff on heat stress in beef cattle. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but we'll be back with more up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Bearded iris can be divided anytime after flowering. In the Midwest, this is often done in late July or August. This allows the replanted portions to have time to develop new roots and become established before freezing weather arrives. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, discusses how to divide and replant iris. Greg, I guess this is really the time we think about dividing iris.
Yeah, we kind of go through a rest period here for many of our perennial plants. And so if you have some iris and maybe they're not blooming as well as they have in the past, getting overcrowded, this would be an ideal time to dig those up, divide, and kind of refresh your iris bed.
So what's the process then? How are we doing this?
So they're fairly easy. They're very shallow rooted, and so it's not too hard to dig those clumps up. Usually dig the whole clump up, remove the old rhizomes, which are just kind of swollen tissue that you see there on the ground that were previously ones that produce flowers and the foliage, but are no longer necessary. So you're really the growing points are on the very ends or where the leaves are, and so you can discard all that other material and get back to where the real actual live tissue is, which is connected to those leaves that you'll see coming up and providing that food energy for the plant.
Kind of a bulb then, or kind of a T shape, a Y shape? What do we got going on here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Kind of a Y shape, I guess, is what you're looking at. So you can break off that portion that is connected to the leaf tissue and to that rhizome, that swollen area that you see. What that's doing is you're kind of moving those iris back to where you originally had them, because as they grow, they just creep out and get bigger and bigger. And so if you're running out of space that way, we have to push them back into where they were originally. And you just snap them off. You can use a knife if you need to, but most of those just kind of break off.
I'm assuming that some of these are going to be in great condition. Some are probably not going to be as well. They might be damaged, maybe some soft rot.
Yes. So you do want a good kind of maybe sturdy or kind of a hard swollen rhizome when you replant. There are some insect or disease issues that can occur out there. And so if you have tissue that's kind of shrunken or soft rot, which would be a disease, which would, as rot things do, they smell, you would be able to tell that, but you would want the healthy portion to put back into the ground. And rhizomes of iris are right at the soil surface, if you will, so you don't really plant it or dig it deep. You just put it right there at soil level. That leaf tissue is building up that food energy, so ideally you don't need to cut that back, but sometimes they're kind of floppy or top-heavy. And occasionally we have the need to remove some of that weight and cut those leaves off a little bit so that your rhizome can get down into the ground and root back down. So you can play that by ear if you want, but we want to make sure those roots of the rhizome start to take hold in our soil before we get into the fall, winter season.
So because this is a thinning process, we want to make sure that we're not over-replanting then?
Yeah, so and you kind of mentioned the Y thing. So you kind of place them as a Y or a triangle, and they'll continue to spread out. So you bring them back to that area. You'll probably have a bunch of leftovers if you want to. You can share those with friends or put them in people's cars when they're not looking, those kind of things. But they are pretty sturdy, hardy plants. And so even if let's say you have time to dig them up but maybe not replant, they'll store okay, maybe in the garage or something like that until you are ready to plant. If you haven't done a soil test since the last time you planted, you may want to do that every 3 to 5 years to make sure there's the nutrients there for those iris to prosper. So check out with your local extension office for soil testing information. Fairly simple and affordable process to make sure that your planting bed is ready to go for your iris. And we should see them come up again the next year then? Yeah, you'll just kind of see them resting, and they may get a little bit of vigor here in the fall season as it cools down. They may have a little desiccation to those leaves during the winter time, a little browning on the edges, but they don't necessarily go away, the leaves themselves. And so next spring you'll see a lot of new flesh growth come out of those divisions that you made, and things should be going well. Typically they'll bloom that next year, so that's why we kind of like to do it now when they're resting. You don't use up a lot of resources, and so next year you should have a pretty good iris bloom. That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with information on dividing and replanting iris. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.